In the summer of 1944, as the fires of the Second World War raged across Europe, an aging German field marshal stood at the crossroads of history, staring into the abyss that his country refused to acknowledge. The Allied armies had landed in Normandy. The beaches that Hitler once boasted could never be taken were now the gateway to the destruction of the Third Reich. Cities burned, divisions crumbled, and the machinery of war that once terrified the world now creaked under the weight of a collapsing empire. Yet inside the marble hallways of the German High Command, denial had become strategy, arrogance had become doctrine, and fantasy had replaced reality. It was in this suffocating environment, this fortress of delusion, that Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt spoke the words that echoed far louder than any artillery barrage: "Make peace, you fools." To understand why those 5 words mattered, and why they were ignored, we must first step into the mindset of a nation teetering on the edge of annihilation, yet unable to see the cliff beneath its feet. Germany, once confident in its blitzkrieg victories and rapid domination of Europe, now watched the tides turn against it on every front. In the east, the Soviet Red Army was pushing relentlessly toward Berlin. On the seas, the Allied navies controlled the Atlantic. In the air, German cities were turned to ash by nightly bombing raids. And now, in the west, the beaches of France had become the cradle of a new invasion that would ultimately seal the fate of the Reich. Rundstedt, the oldest and one of the most experienced field marshals in Hitler's military hierarchy, had seen this moment coming long before it arrived. He was not a man of theatrics or emotional outbursts. His life had been shaped by discipline, precision, and the cold realism of the Prussian military tradition. He had served through the First World War, watched Germany rise and fall and rise again, and commanded armies across half of Europe. But unlike many of his ambitious colleagues, Rundstedt's ambition had long since eroded, replaced instead by the tired wisdom of a soldier who had seen too much to believe in illusions. Throughout the war, Rundstedt had warned Berlin that a two-front conflict was unwinnable. He advised careful retreats, strategic withdrawals, and political negotiation. But his advice was rarely welcomed. Hitler despised pessimism, even when it was the truth. The High Command preferred flattery to strategy, blind obedience to professional insight. Those who disagreed with Hitler were dismissed, sidelined, or replaced. And so Rundstedt, despite his title and reputation, was constantly overruled by men who possessed more ideological loyalty than military competence. When the Allies landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, Rundstedt immediately recognized the danger. He had predicted such an invasion for months. He knew the power the Allies could unleash once they had a firm foothold on the continent. He understood that Germany no longer had the reserves, fuel, or air superiority to repel a full-scale assault. Yet Hitler believed the invasion was a feint. He was convinced that the real attack would happen at Pas-de-Calais. So he refused to release the armored divisions that Rundstedt desperately needed for a counterattack. As the days turned into weeks, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The German armies in France, already undermanned and under-equipped, were being pushed back by an enemy that controlled the skies and possessed endless supplies. Rundstedt watched as his divisions shattered one after another, their strength eroded by constant bombardment and overwhelming numerical superiority. He sent urgent messages to Berlin describing the desperate state of the front, but the response was always the same: hold the line, fight to the last man, no retreat. By the 25th day after D-Day, Rundstedt had reached his breaking point. He had spent nearly a month watching the annihilation of his forces. He had watched the arrogance of the Nazi leadership destroy every opportunity for strategic withdrawal. He had tried to reason with them, to present a realistic assessment, to urge them toward negotiation. Nothing worked. Hitler's entourage insisted that victory was still possible, that miracle weapons would change the course of the war, that the Allies would falter. Rundstedt knew these were fantasies, dangerous, lethal fantasies. So, in a rare moment of fury, the old marshal abandoned his lifelong restraint. When asked by the German High Command what they should do to stop the Allied advance, Rundstedt fired back with the most honest answer anyone had given since the war began. His voice was not merely frustrated, it was filled with the exhausted clarity of a man who had nothing left to lose. Make peace, you fools. This wasn't simply a suggestion. It was a verdict. A warning. A final attempt to jolt a delusional regime back to reality. And yet, Berlin ignored him once again. Within hours, Rundstedt was dismissed from his command. His words, however, would echo through history, not just because of their brutal simplicity, but because they exposed the moral and strategic blindness that characterized the final years of the Third Reich. Rundstedt was not a saint, nor was he free of the flaws that plagued the German military aristocracy. But in that moment, he was the only man willing to acknowledge the truth: the war was lost, and the only way to save German lives was through surrender. This documentary-style narrative explores the events that led to that explosive statement. It examines the mental collapse of the German High Command, the strategic disasters that culminated in the Normandy invasion, and the tragic consequences of ignoring reality in wartime. It is the story of a general who tried to stop the inevitable tragedy of his nation, and a regime that chose destruction over reason. And as we revisit these moments, we must ask ourselves, how different might history have been if someone in power had listened? The morning of June 6, 1944, dawned over Normandy with a quiet calm that masked the largest military operation the world had ever seen. From miles out at sea, the Allied Armada, over 7,000 vessels carrying more than 156,000 men, approached the French coastline. In the skies above, 11,000 aircraft provided support, dominating the airspace in a display of unparalleled coordination. Paratroopers had already begun landing behind German lines, seizing bridges, road junctions, and key positions to sow chaos in the enemy rear. This was not a raid, this was the beginning of the end for Hitler's European empire. Far to the east, in the heavily fortified Wolf's Lair, Hitler slept, or at least appeared to. His paranoia, delusions, and obsession with the idea of the Pas-de-Calais as the true target of invasion meant that crucial armored divisions were withheld from action. Instead of allowing experienced generals like Rundstedt and Field Marshal Rommel to coordinate an effective counterattack, Hitler clung to fantasy, believing that the Normandy landings were merely a diversion. Each hour that passed without decisive action allowed the Allies to consolidate their positions, bring in reinforcements, and build the logistical foundation for a sustained campaign. In France, Rundstedt, the commander-in-chief of the Western Front, immediately understood the enormity of the threat. His instincts were honed by decades of military experience that had taken him from the staff offices of World War I to the victories in Poland and France, to the bitter defeats in the Soviet Union. He saw clearly that Germany's armored reserves, the panzer divisions, were in precisely the wrong position. They were spread thin along the coast, vulnerable to air and naval bombardment, rather than concentrated inland, ready to strike at the decisive point. He called for their release immediately, knowing that speed and mass strength were the only factors that could blunt the invasion. But in Berlin, the system was broken. Orders went up to Hitler, who sat miles away in the Bavarian mountains. Communications were slow, but more importantly, Hitler refused to trust the judgment of the generals on the ground. He believed in miracles, in technological salvation, in the sheer force of will. Rundstedt and his colleagues, no matter how precise or truthful their analysis, were powerless. By the time the armored divisions finally received orders to move, hours later, they were already in the sights of Allied fighter bombers. Tanks and trucks were destroyed on the roads, supply columns burned, and counterattacks became disjointed, piecemeal, and inevitably unsuccessful. The first day of the invasion, known as D-Day, revealed the catastrophic consequences of Hitler's interference. At Omaha Beach, American forces ran into the 352nd Infantry Division and suffered grievous casualties, over 2,000 in mere hours. Elsewhere, British and Canadian troops met determined but insufficient German resistance. The beaches were secured, the paratroopers linked up, and the Allies had established a foothold that would expand with relentless efficiency. The German panzer divisions, delayed and scattered, were unable to mount the counterattack that might have reversed the tide. By evening, the opportunity to crush the Allied beachhead had passed, and the momentum shifted irreversibly in favor of the invading forces. The days following the landings brought mounting disaster for Germany. The Allies advanced, capturing key ports and strategic locations. Cherbourg fell by June 27, providing a deep-water harbor for the rapid influx of men, tanks, artillery, and supplies. The Cotentin Peninsula, which should have served as a base for German operations, was lost. Every failed counterattack, every piecemeal deployment of armor, cost Germany irreplaceable tanks, vehicles, and, most critically, experienced crews. Every hour the front held, it bled, weakening the army that could never recover its strength. Rundstedt watched with growing despair as his predictions came true, every calculation confirmed by the relentless advance of the Allies. Yet the command structure in Germany remained paralyzed by ideology and delusion. Hitler's obsession with the Pas-de-Calais Phantom Army and his distrust of his generals meant that even when evidence of the invasion scale was undeniable, he refused to release authority to those who could act. Field Marshal Rommel, tasked with coastal defense, was equally frustrated. He understood the nature of modern warfare, the lethal combination of artillery, air power, and mechanized infantry. But the German High Command had become a system designed to filter truth. Honest reporting was punished, alternative assessments ignored. The result was catastrophic, a military hierarchy increasingly divorced from reality, making decisions not on fact, but on comforting illusion. By June 17, 11 days after the invasion, Rundstedt and Rommel met Hitler at his command bunker in Marival. Hitler's presence was a spectacle, pale, trembling, and increasingly erratic. The Führer appeared less like the omnipotent dictator of legend and more like a man unhinged by age, stress, and disease. Parkinson's symptoms, later confirmed by historians, were already visible in his tremors, stoop, and frailty. But his delusions remained as strong as ever. The generals laid out the situation in brutal clarity, casualties mounting at unsustainable rates, armored reserves dissipated, air and naval superiority lost, and no realistic prospect of regaining the initiative. Rundstedt's assessment was precise and unambiguous: the war in the West was lost. The only rational choice was to seek an end to the fighting before total destruction, before the annihilation of German cities and soldiers alike. He spoke not as a man trying to mollify his superiors, but as a professional soldier offering the truth as he saw it. Hitler, predictably, rejected the counsel. He insisted that new divisions, miracle weapons, and sheer will would turn the tide. He demanded that the troops hold to the last man, that retreat was unthinkable, and that victory remained possible if only the generals would believe as he did. Over the next 2 weeks, the consequences of ignoring reality became increasingly stark. The Allied forces, having secured the beaches and brought in reinforcements, now pushed inland. The British advanced toward Caen, a city whose capture had been a central objective for Montgomery. Every German counterattack required to slow the Allies drained the remaining reserves. Panzer divisions, once intended for strategic counteroffensive use, were gradually destroyed in piecemeal battles, unable to regain the initiative. Each failed attack, each lost engagement, confirmed Rundstedt's warnings: the German army could not stop the Allies, and continued resistance would only prolong the inevitable destruction. On July 1, 1944, the tipping point was reached. The collapse of defensive positions around Cherbourg and the deteriorating situation in Normandy prompted a telephone call from Wilhelm Keitel, representing Hitler's high command. Rundstedt had no patience left for political theater. When asked what should be done to stabilize the front, his response was blunt, direct, and devastating: "End the war, you idiots. What else can you do?" The words were more than a military assessment, they were a moral indictment. Germany, through the fanaticism and delusion of its leadership, had trapped itself in a cycle of destruction. The commanders who understood reality were ignored, punished, or eliminated. Rundstedt's dismissal the following day confirmed the pattern: honesty in the German High Command was a liability. The system rewarded those who told the Führer what he wanted to hear and punished those who dared speak the truth. The weeks that followed reinforced the tragic correctness of Rundstedt's analysis. Operation Cobra, the American breakout at St. Lo, shattered the German front. The counterattacks demanded by Hitler consumed what remained of the panzer divisions. Tens of thousands of soldiers were killed or captured, their loss irreplaceable. German cities faced increasing devastation from Allied air raids. On the Eastern Front, the Red Army continued its inexorable advance. Berlin itself was now within reach of a coalition determined to crush the Reich entirely. Even in the aftermath of his dismissal, Rundstedt's influence lingered, albeit silently. His replacements, no more capable than he had been, were forced to implement strategies doomed to fail. Field Marshal Gerd von Kluge, then Albert Kesselring, and other successors faced the same impossible conditions: a decaying army, overwhelming enemy resources, and a leadership committed to fantasy over fact. The Ardennes Offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge, exemplified the futility of Hitler's decisions. Despite the brief tactical surprise, the operation collapsed due to lack of fuel, inadequate planning, and Allied resilience, exactly as Rundstedt had predicted. The story of the German High Command in 1944 is more than a military case study, it is a cautionary tale about the dangers of silencing truth. In the Nazi command structure, the filter of ideological loyalty overrode the filter of reality. Good intelligence was discarded, experienced advice ignored, and competent commanders were replaced by subordinates willing to lie or flatter. Each layer of deception further isolated Hitler from the consequences of his decisions. By the time reality imposed itself on the battlefield, it was too late for correction. The war continued not because victory was possible, but because delusion had become operational doctrine. Rundstedt's foresight, clarity, and moral courage stand in stark contrast to the decay around him. He was a professional soldier who had dedicated his life to understanding warfare, yet found himself powerless against a regime whose ideology corrupted command decisions. His insistence on honesty, his unwillingness to pretend that Germany could still win, ultimately cost him his command, but preserved his integrity. He recognized that prolonging the conflict would not change the outcome, it would only increase death and destruction. His words, "End the war, you fools," resonate not simply as a military judgment but as a timeless lesson on leadership, truth, and responsibility. The Normandy campaign, in which Rundstedt played a central role, illustrates the deadly consequences of ignoring reality. The Allies' success was built not merely on superior resources or planning, but on the German leadership's refusal to listen. Each delayed counterattack, each misallocated division, and each flawed decision accelerated Germany's collapse. By mid-1944, the once mighty Wehrmacht in the West was bleeding to death, and the only lifeline, the hope of strategic counterattacks, was squandered in bureaucratic delay and ideological fantasy. Rundstedt had seen it coming, warned about it, and was dismissed for doing so. As the weeks turned into months, Germany's military and civilian population paid the ultimate price for the systemic suppression of truth. Cities were bombed into oblivion. Soldiers died in futile counterattacks. The Eastern Front collapsed under relentless Soviet pressure. The West crumbled under the weight of Allied logistics, firepower, and tactical ingenuity. By the time surrender finally came on May 8, 1945, the consequences of ignoring Rundstedt's warnings had been written in blood and fire across Europe. As the war in Europe drew toward its catastrophic conclusion, the figure of Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt emerges not merely as a participant, but as a witness to history's most extraordinary failures of judgment and leadership. His story is one of foresight, professional integrity, and the tragic consequences of truth ignored. In the months after D-Day, the Allied forces continued to push deeper into German-held territory, and the consequences of the Nazi leadership's paralysis became increasingly visible, not just on battlefields, but in the ruined cities, displaced populations, and shattered military units strewn across the continent. Rundstedt's warnings, once dismissed as defeatist, were tragically validated in every engagement, every collapsed front, and every futile German counterattack. By late summer 1944, the Allies had liberated Paris and continued their advance across France. The German army, once feared as an invincible force, now staggered under relentless pressure, hampered by logistical collapse, shattered morale, and a leadership consumed by ideology rather than reality. Rundstedt, having been dismissed from command in the West, observed from the sidelines the unraveling he had long predicted. He saw divisions annihilated, towns razed, and the human cost of the war spiral upward. The wisdom he had offered, strategic withdrawal, pragmatic defense, or negotiated settlement, was consistently ignored, replaced by Hitler's compulsive insistence on standing firm to the last man. The results were catastrophic. The moral and operational failings of the Nazi leadership extended far beyond tactical errors. Hitler's refusal to heed advice from his most experienced commanders amplified the already overwhelming superiority of the Allies. By constraining the decisions of generals like Rundstedt and Rommel, Hitler ensured that every operation, every strategic move, was delayed, mismanaged, or outright disastrous. The consequences were visible in Normandy, in the Ardennes, and ultimately on the Eastern Front. Soldiers were ordered to hold indefensible positions, armored divisions were deployed piecemeal against overwhelming forces, and critical opportunities to stabilize the front were lost. The human cost of these decisions cannot be overstated. Tens of thousands of soldiers, many conscripted and young, perished in futile engagements, and countless civilians suffered under the resulting bombardments, sieges, and forced evacuations. Rundstedt's role in these events underscores a central theme: the dangers of a military system in which honesty and professional judgment are subordinated to ideology and personal loyalty. Time and again, he observed the consequences of Hitler's interference: delayed counterattacks, misallocated reserves, and strategic paralysis. Every decision made by Hitler, often in isolation and without consultation, exacerbated Germany's vulnerability. Rundstedt's advocacy for rational, evidence-based military planning was systematically rejected. Yet, even in the face of such obstruction, he maintained his focus on minimizing unnecessary loss, guiding those under his command with professionalism and moral clarity. The liberation of France and the collapse of German positions in the West marked a decisive turning point. By September 1944, the Allies had crossed the Seine, captured key ports, and were advancing toward the German border. Rundstedt, while sidelined, watched as the operational principles he had championed, concentration of force, timely maneuver, avoidance of piecemeal attacks, were violated at every turn. In the Ardennes offensive, Hitler's last major gamble to reverse the Allied advance. Rundstedt's warnings about insufficient planning, inadequate fuel, and overextended supply lines were again ignored. The offensive achieved only temporary success and collapsed under logistical and operational constraints, leaving the German army further weakened. The human dimension of Rundstedt's perspective is striking. Unlike many in the Nazi hierarchy, he understood the relationship between leadership, operational integrity, and the lives of those under his command. He recognized that unnecessary losses were not just statistics, they were young men, trained and committed, sacrificed to the delusions of a dictator. His repeated calls for rational assessment, for operational pragmatism, and for acknowledgement of reality reveal a leader committed to duty yet deeply aware of the limits imposed by the higher command's ideological rigidity. This moral clarity sets him apart in a leadership structure increasingly dominated by fanaticism, self-interest, and fear. As the Allies pressed into Germany in early 1945, Rundstedt's earlier predictions were realized in full measure. Cities burned, transportation networks collapsed, and German defenses disintegrated under relentless pressure from the west and the east. The once formidable Wehrmacht was reduced to a shadow of its former self, incapable of meaningful resistance. Rundstedt's insight into the inevitability of Germany's defeat, if Hitler's interference continued, had been proven correct. The delay in surrender, driven by ideology rather than strategy, inflicted immeasurable suffering on both military personnel and civilians. In evaluating Rundstedt's legacy, it is critical to recognize both his tactical acumen and his moral courage. He was a professional soldier who understood the dynamics of modern warfare, the interplay of logistics, armor, and morale. Yet he was also a man constrained by circumstances beyond his control, navigating a system in which rational advice was repeatedly ignored. His repeated dismissal and the inability of the German High Command to implement his recommendations illustrate a systemic failure of governance, one in which ideology trumped reality, and loyalty to an individual overrode the imperatives of national survival. Historically, Rundstedt's experience offers a powerful lesson about leadership, accountability, and the consequences of suppressing dissent. His insistence on confronting inconvenient truths, advocating for operational pragmatism, and prioritizing the preservation of human life provides a stark contrast to the delusional and destructive decision-making exhibited by Hitler and his inner circle. Where the Führer's decisions were guided by paranoia and fantasy, Rundstedt's were guided by experience, observation, and reason. The tragedy of his position was that such rationality was ultimately powerless in a system designed to ignore it. The final months of the war underscored the consequences of ignoring sound military counsel. By March and April of 1945, the Allies had crossed the Rhine and were advancing rapidly into the heart of Germany. The Soviet army was closing from the east, bringing an equally relentless and unforgiving pressure. Rundstedt, no longer in command, could only watch as his predictions, of operational collapse, catastrophic loss of life, and ultimate defeat, were fulfilled. The Wehrmacht's inability to stabilize the front or mount effective counterattacks confirmed what he had long argued: Germany had no viable path to victory, and only by acknowledging this reality could further unnecessary destruction have been prevented. Even after the war, Rundstedt's reflections provide insight into the nature of command under extreme circumstances. His recognition of the limits of power, the dangers of ideological interference, and the ethical responsibilities of a military leader have been noted by historians as essential lessons in military strategy and leadership studies. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Rundstedt demonstrated an awareness of the human dimension of warfare, understanding that strategy, logistics, and tactical proficiency must be balanced with the ethical imperative to preserve life whenever possible. In sum, the story of Gerd von Rundstedt during the Normandy campaign and the broader final year of World War II is one of tragic foresight, professional excellence, and moral integrity. His warnings about the consequences of Hitler's interference were ignored, and the results were catastrophic: the accelerated destruction of German forces, the immense suffering of soldiers and civilians, and the unalterable march toward defeat. Yet his conduct, commitment to truth, and unwavering professionalism stand as a testament to the values of leadership grounded in reality rather than ideology. The lessons of Rundstedt's experience remain relevant today. Military and organizational leaders are reminded that ignoring expertise, suppressing dissent, and allowing ideology to override pragmatic decision-making carries severe consequences. History demonstrates that no matter the size of an army, the fervor of belief, or the technological advantage, ignoring reality and marginalizing the voices of those with experience and insight leads inevitably to failure. Rundstedt's career is a case study in the importance of listening to informed counsel, respecting the limits of command, and understanding that ethical leadership requires the courage to speak the truth, even when it is inconvenient or unwelcome. As we reflect on the catastrophic decisions of 1944, the Normandy invasion, and the final months of the war, Gerd von Rundstedt's presence as a figure of clarity and reason is unmistakable. His experience illuminates the perils of leadership detached from truth, the consequences of ideological rigidity, and the enduring value of professional integrity. While history cannot change, it can teach, and the lessons drawn from Rundstedt's actions, warnings, and ultimate sidelining continue to resonate as a powerful reminder: the courage to speak truth in the face of delusion is as vital in war as it is in peace. Ultimately, the narrative of Rundstedt, Normandy, and the collapse of the German army in 1944 to 1945 is not only a story of military failure but also a meditation on human judgment, leadership, and responsibility. The Allied success, facilitated by the German High Command's systemic errors, stands juxtaposed with the tragic consequences of silenced counsel. The deaths, the destruction, and the suffering that ensued were the direct results of ignoring reason, evidence, and experienced advice. Rundstedt's voice, prophetic in its clarity, reminds us that leadership is not merely about command, rank, or obedience. It is about foresight, honesty, and the courage to act in accordance with reality, no matter how inconvenient or dangerous such action may be. In the annals of history, Rundstedt's warnings endure as a testament to the consequences of failing to listen to experience and reason. His life, career, and the events surrounding the Normandy campaign provide an enduring lesson on the delicate balance between authority and insight, between ideology and pragmatism, and between obedience and moral responsibility. In the shadows of the Allied advance, Amidst the ruin of German defenses, and against the backdrop of a war that engulfed the entire continent, the prescient voice of Gerd von Rundstedt remains a powerful reminder of what is lost when truth is ignored, and the price humanity pays when leadership chooses illusion over reality.